Boston Logan International Airport was the kind of place that forgot you the moment you stepped inside it. Not cruelly, not deliberately, just the way large systems forgot individuals through volume, through motion, through the simple mathematics of too many people moving in too many directions at once. The terminal absorbed everyone equally. The businessman in the tailored coat, the college student dragging an overweight duffel, the family with the stroller and the argument and the gate number they couldn't find. All of them swallowed by the same fluorescent light, the same recycled air, the same announcements drifting overhead like weather that had no interest in any particular person standing beneath it. Ray Calloway walked through it the way he walked through most things, quietly, without announcement. He was 58 years old, though most people, when they bothered to look, would have guessed somewhere north of that. Not because he looked worn exactly, but because he carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone a long time ago and had since grown comfortable in that stopping. His jacket was dark plain, the kind bought for function rather than impression. His shoes were well made but travel scuffed at the toes in the way that shoes got when they had covered real distance over real years. His hair had gone almost entirely silver somewhere in the last 4 years, and he had not thought much about it. There were other things to think about. Lily walked beside him. She was 7 years old, and she held his hand with both of hers the way she did when she was tired but trying not to show it. Her small pink backpack rode high on her shoulders, adjusted precisely the way he had adjusted it for her before they left the hotel that morning. Her stuffed rabbit, a white one with a missing button eye that she had named Captain, for reasons she had never fully explained, and he had never pushed her to explain, was tucked under her left arm with the practiced security of a child who had learned never to put her most important thing down in public spaces. She wore a yellow sweater that was slightly too big for her, the sleeves falling past her wrists in a way that should have looked sloppy, but somehow didn't. She had insisted on wearing it since September, and would likely insist on wearing it until someone convinced her otherwise, which Ray had no intention of trying to do. It had been Margaret's favorite color. He didn't argue about the sweater. He didn't argue about Captain the Rabbit. He had learned in the years since Margaret died that the small things were often the only things children could hold on to when the large things had stopped making sense. The large things had stopped making sense for Lily when she was 3 years old, and she had been quietly rebuilding her version of sense ever since. And the yellow sweater was part of that architecture. And Ray understood that some structures were not meant to be questioned. So Lily wore the yellow sweater and carried the rabbit, and he carried everything else. The rolling briefcase behind him moved smoothly over the polished terminal floor. Inside it, everything was organized the way Ray organized everything, not obsessively but precisely, and there was a difference that mattered to him. Obsession was about control. Precision was about respect for what mattered. The folder with Lily's medical documentation sat on top, tabbed with color-coded markers and ordered chronologically. Behind it, the printed itinerary with the confirmation numbers highlighted. Behind that, a set of forms he had learned over 31 years of professional life to carry with him wherever he went, because the gap between what was supposed to happen and what actually happened had a way of requiring documentation on short notice. Terminal B at Logan was quieter than it would have been 3 hours earlier. The Friday evening rush had passed its peak. The departure board still blinked with destinations Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, Denver, but the lines at most gates had thinned to a manageable patience. The ambient noise had dropped from the full roar of peak travel to a steady institutional hum. Somewhere behind them, a child was crying the specific cry of exhaustion rather than injury, and a woman's voice was answering it in the low rhythmic register of a mother who had been answering that cry for long enough that it had become its own kind of language. Their flight to Chicago was still showing on time. Gate B14, boarding in 40 minutes. Ray checked the time on the plane watch on his left wrist. Not a device that buzzed and displayed notifications and tracked his steps and reminded him of meetings. Just a watch, the analog kind with a white face and black hands and a small date window in the lower right corner positioned between 4 and 5. Margaret had given it to him on their 20th anniversary, wrapping it herself in paper she had printed with a pattern of small compasses, because she said he always needed to know where he was going. He had worn it every day since she gave it to him, including the days he had not wanted to wear anything at all. Lily tugged his sleeve. "Are we late?" "No." He looked down at her. The fluorescent light caught the particular paleness she'd had since the procedures, not sickly, just the temporary quiet of a body doing repair work. "We have time." She accepted this with a small nod, the kind she gave when she believed him completely. There was something both reassuring and quietly devastating about the absoluteness of a child's trust. It asked nothing of you except that you be worthy of it, and it never occurred to the child to consider that being worthy of it was sometimes the hardest thing in the world. They had been in Boston for 11 days. 11 days at Boston Children's Hospital, where a specialist named Dr. Anita Voss, careful, direct, the kind of doctor who looked at children rather than past them, had spent 3 of those days running pressure sensitivity assessments on Lily following the surgical procedure she had undergone in June. The surgery itself had gone as well as these things went. The hearing reconstruction, the careful, precise work inside Lily's left ear that Ray still could not fully think about, without something contracting in his chest, had achieved what it was designed to achieve. But pressure sensitivity was a documented complication of the procedure, one that required monitoring at intervals, and the monitoring required Boston. And Boston required 11 days in an extended stay hotel 2 blocks from the hospital, where Ray had read the same 3 paperback novels twice, and ordered takeout from the same 4 restaurants in rotation, and sat by the window at night, looking out at the street below, thinking about the things he usually kept in the background of his mind where they belonged. The treatment series had concluded the day before. Dr. Voss had been careful and thorough and honest in the way the best doctors were honest, giving you what you needed to know, in the order you needed to know it, without the softening that sometimes obscured the actual information. The pressure sensitivity was improving measurably. Commercial flight was approved but carried a recommendation front cabin seating where pressure variance was reduced, where the environment was more stable, where there was less risk of the nausea and disorientation that Lily had experienced on the outbound flight 3 weeks ago before the full extent of the sensitivity had been established. Ray had the note. He had 3 copies of the note, one in the main folder, one in the briefcase's outer pocket, and a photograph on his phone taken specifically so that if the folder and the briefcase were both somehow unavailable, he would still be able to produce documentation. This was not paranoia. This was the practice of someone who understood that systems worked smoothly until they didn't, and that the moment they stopped working smoothly was exactly the moment documentation became essential. He had booked the business class seats in July, the same week the Boston appointment was confirmed. Seats 2A and 2B, window and aisle port side, Chicago-bound Friday evening. He had paid for them without calculation because some expenditures were not about comfort or preference or the kind of small indulgence that required justification. They were about the specific, documented, medically supported need of a 7-year-old girl who had already spent more months inside hospitals than any 7-year-old should have to, and who deserved to make the flight home without pressure building in her repaired ear and her face going pale against the headrest. At security, an agent had glanced at the medical file notation attached to Lily's boarding information and waved them through the shorter line with a nod that carried actual acknowledgement rather than mere procedure. Lily had smiled at the agent with the particular brightness she reserved for strangers who were unexpectedly kind, a brightness that Ray suspected would remain in the agent's mind for the rest of that shift and possibly longer. He had felt briefly something loosen in his chest in the way things occasionally loosened when the world behaved better than expected. Now they were at gate B14, and the boarding line was beginning to organize itself. Ray noticed Grant Ellison before Grant Ellison noticed him, which had come to feel over many years of professional life like a fairly reliable indicator of the difference between 2 people. The man was somewhere in his early 50s, the specific early 50s that had been maintained with deliberate effort, Jim maintained, groomed with care, wearing a suit that communicated expense without announcing it, the kind of garment that cost enough to look effortless. He stood near the boarding podium with the easy, unself-conscious confidence of someone who had spent several decades in rooms where his arrival was registered and his preferences were anticipated. A carry-on bag with a discreet designer logo leaned against his leg. He was speaking into his phone in the measured, unhurried tone of a man who assumed the world would wait while he finished his thought, because it generally had. The woman beside him, Ray would learn, was Diane Ellison. She wore oversized sunglasses indoors, not as eye protection, because the terminal lighting required none, but as the specific signal of someone who preferred to observe without being observed. She scrolled through her phone with the focused attention of a person who had learned to make herself self-contained in public spaces. Ray guided Lily to a pair of seats near the window and settled her. She leaned against his arm immediately and closed her eyes, not sleeping, just resting in the way children did when they had been asked to be brave for an extended period and needed a moment to stop performing bravery. Her hand found his jacket sleeve and held it loosely. "Can I sleep on the plane?" she murmured. "You definitely will." "In the big seat. In the big seat." That was sufficient. She closed her eyes the rest of the way. Ray sat still beside her and observed the gate area without appearing to do so. This was a skill developed over 31 years at the Federal Aviation Administration, the ability to gather a room completely while appearing to be simply present in it. He had used it in cockpit voice recorder reviews, in maintenance facility inspections, in the deposition rooms, where airline executives tried to perform confidence, while his team's documentation dismantled the performance piece by piece. He had used it in congressional briefings and in the quieter, more consequential meetings where the decisions were actually made. He had used it in every environment where understanding a situation before acting in it was the difference between a productive outcome and a wasted one. He had been good at the work, more than good. For the last decade of his career at the FAA, he had run the Accommodation Compliance Division. Not the division with the largest budget or the most visible mandate. Not crash investigation, not airworthiness, certification. The Accommodation Division dealt with the gap between policy as written and policy as practiced, which was a smaller sounding problem than it was. Policy as written was what airlines submitted in their compliance documentation. Policy as practiced was what gate staff actually did at 10 o'clock on a Friday night when a captain was impatient to push back and a businessman was waiting for his upgrade, and there was a tired father at the door with a medical note that nobody had read. The framework Ray had built over those years, the documentation standards, the escalation procedures, the medical accommodation protocols with their specific language about pediatric cases and surgical complications and pressure sensitivity had become the baseline requirement in multiple major carrier partnership agreements. Airlines signed it as a condition, not voluntarily, not enthusiastically. But because the Regional Airports Authority had made it a requirement, and because Ray's team had spent enough years demonstrating what happened when it wasn't followed, he had not built it for recognition. He had built it because he understood at a level that was both professional and entirely personal what happened when systems failed the people they were designed to protect. He understood it with a completeness that had no clean edges, that was still 4 years later capable of arriving without warning in the space between one thought and the next. He thought about Margaret. He allowed himself this just a moment, the way you sometimes touched a bruise to confirm it hadn't healed yet. She had been gone 4 years. A cardiac event sudden at 49 years old in their kitchen on a Tuesday morning in November, while Lily was at kindergarten and Ray was in Washington at a deposition for an investigation that had taken his team 14 months to complete. The investigation concerned an airline that had falsified maintenance records on 17 aircraft over a period of 4 years. The report Ray's team had produced was complete, accurate, and correct in every particular. It had been submitted through proper channels on a Monday morning. It had sat in an administrative queue for 11 days. Not because anyone suppressed it, not because anyone acted improperly, because the scheduler's office was managing a backlog, because government systems operated on government timelines, because 11 days was not in the ordinary measure of things a significant delay. On the third day of those 11 days, Margaret died. Not because of the investigation, not because of the queue, not because of anything Ray had done or failed to do in any professional capacity. Her heart stopped on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen of a life she had built carefully and loved completely, and no report and no queue and no administrative backlog had any connection to it whatsoever. But Ray had been 3 hours away when it happened, and he had not known for 40 minutes because his phone had been off during deposition preparation, and Margaret had always said on mornings when he had early calls, "Don't let anyone interrupt you for small things." And the people around her had not immediately understood that this was not a small thing. 40 minutes. The connection Ray carried was not causal. He understood that. He had understood it from the beginning with the clarity of someone whose professional life required distinguishing between correlation and cause. The report had not killed Margaret. The queue had not killed Margaret. His being in Washington had not killed Margaret. But 11 days was the number that lived in him. 11 days was the measure of what could happen in a gap that seemed manageable, that seemed within normal tolerance, that seemed like the kind of delay that systems absorbed without consequence. 11 days was what it looked like when a process worked exactly as designed and still failed to account for what it couldn't see. He had stayed at the FAA for nearly a year after Margaret died because stopping felt like a betrayal of the work, and because stopping would have left a gap in the operations he had built, and he was not yet ready to trust that gap to someone else. Then he had understood gradually, and then all at once, that staying was also a kind of failure. A failure of the specific obligation that had superseded every professional one, which was the obligation to be present for the 7-year-old girl who had lost her mother and still needed her father to be somewhere that was not 3 hours away. He had left. He had taken 31 years of knowledge and a clear understanding of where the real work was and started Callaway Compliance Group from a 2-room office in Lincoln Park with a small staff of people who understood what they were doing and why, and a client list that grew steadily because the need was constant and the work was real, and Ray had spent long enough inside the system to know exactly where it bent under pressure. Nearly a year after founding the company, the partnership was profitable. 3 years in, it was respected in the specific, quiet way that organizations became respected when they were consistently right about things that mattered. Ray still knew every client by name, still reviewed every significant report before it went out, still answered his own phone when calls came in after hours from team members who had found something in an audit that needed a senior judgment before morning. Continental Airways had become a client 14 months ago. Their partnership renewal with the Regional Airports Authority had required an independent compliance audit as a condition, not optional, not discretionary. Ray's team had spent 4 months inside Continental's operations. They had reviewed crew documentation procedures and medical accommodation handling and gate staff training, and the specific question that was always the most important question in any audit: what actually happens at the point of contact when the policy meets the person it's supposed to protect, when the pressure is real and the documentation is inconvenient and the departure board is showing a delay that nobody wants? The audit had produced a thorough report. The recommendations had been accepted, all of them, which was unusual, and spoke to someone at Continental, understanding that the cost of acceptance was lower than the cost of the alternative. The partnership agreement had been signed with the compliance framework attached as a binding operational condition. Ray had not anticipated sitting in one of Continental's terminal gates 7 months later, watching those operational conditions be violated in real time by the airline's own staff at the expense of his daughter's medically documented needs. But this was the thing about systems, the thing he had spent 30 years documenting. They performed under observation. They performed during audits and reviews and the periods immediately following compliance events when everyone was paying attention. And then gradually, under the ordinary pressures of ordinary operations, they reverted. Not maliciously, not conspiratorially, just the way water found its level, the path of least resistance. The accommodation that was easier than the one that was correct. The boarding line was forming. Business class first, then premium economy, then the longer, more patient queue of everyone else. Ray woke Lily gently with a hand on her shoulder, helped her adjust captain's position under her arm. "We're boarding," he said quietly. "Okay." She rubbed her eyes with the back of one wrist. "Are we first?" "Close enough." They joined the shorter line. The gate agent, a young woman whose name tag read Pam, who was scanning passes with the practiced efficiency of someone 12 hours into a long shift, who had developed the ability to process passengers without fully registering them as individuals, waved through the 2 passengers ahead of them without incident. Ray stepped forward and handed over both boarding passes. Pam scanned his. The scanner made its sound. She frowned at the screen, not dramatically, just the small functional frown of someone whose screen had returned something unexpected. She scanned it again. Ray waited. He was good at waiting. She reached to the side of the podium where a small printer had apparently already produced something and handed him a freshly printed boarding slip. Her expression was not unkind. It was simply already moving to the next transaction, the way the expressions of people in processing roles move not from callousness, but from the specific detachment required to do a high-volume job without accumulating the weight of each individual interaction. Ray looked down at the slip. 28B middle seat. He looked at the second slip. Lily's 28A window seat, economy class. He stood very still. The gate noise continued around him, the boarding announcement from the next gate over the distant sound of a child running, and being called back, the mechanical hum rising from the jet bridge. He was aware of all of it, and he was aware of the number on the slip, and he was aware of Lily beside him, and he did what he did when confronted with information that required a careful response rather than a reactive one. He stood still and let the information settle into its correct shape before he spoke. He looked up at Pam. "I think there's been a mistake," he said. His voice was even. Pam shook her head. No mistake, sir. Your seats were adjusted before boarding. We booked business class, seats 2A and 2B. He held up the original boarding passes. My daughter has a medical accommodation note attached to this reservation front cabin seating, documented pressure sensitivity following ear surgery. I can see that in the system. Then you can see why row 28 is a problem. Pam opened her mouth and then closed it because a flight attendant had appeared at the aircraft door and was coming down the jet bridge with the particular bearing of someone who had been sent to manage a situation and expected to manage it successfully. She was in her late 30s with the practiced composure of someone who had learned over many years of the job to move through conflict without appearing to engage with it directly. Her uniform was neat. Her expression was professionally pleasant in the way that professional pleasantness was a form of armor rather than a feeling. This was Sandra Pruitt, though Ray didn't know her name yet. She stepped onto the jet bridge with the unhurried confidence of a person who expected the room to arrange itself around her arrival. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Her voice was pleasant, not warm. "There appears to be a seating discrepancy," Ray said. "We were booked in business class with a documented medical accommodation for my daughter. We've been reassigned to row 28. Sandra Pruitt performed the assessment quickly, the kind that people in her position learn to perform in the first few seconds of any interaction, sorting passengers into categories based on the markers that experience had taught her to read. Ray was familiar with this kind of assessment. He had studied it professionally. He understood exactly what she saw when she looked at him. A tired man, plain jacket, worn shoes, silver hair, a small child beside him. No visible markers of status. No executive bearing. No membership card extended with the unconscious confidence of someone who expected it to change the dynamic. Just a tired father with a child standing in the way of an on-time departure. He saw the decision form in her face before she spoke. It was not cruelty. He wanted to be accurate about this because accuracy mattered even when the conclusions were uncomfortable. It was the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to categorize passengers by their likelihood of accepting inconvenience quietly, and who had determined in the span of 3 seconds which category he belonged to. "Sir," she said with the smooth finality of someone drawing a conversation to its conclusion, "those seats were needed for priority passengers. I understand this is inconvenient. Your seats in row 28 will be perfectly suitable for the flight." Ray said nothing for a moment. Behind him, Grant Ellison shifted his weight. His carry-on bag made a small sound against the boarding bridge floor. Impatience communicated through objects rather than words, which was Ray had noticed over many years, how people with a certain kind of confidence communicated impatience when they felt direct expression would be beneath them. "Those seats were booked 3 months ago," Ray said. "The medical accommodation is on the reservation. Your check-in staff confirmed it this afternoon." "We're aware of the notation." "Then you understand why row 28 isn't medically appropriate." Sandra Pruitt's composure did not break. It simply settled into something denser, the particular hardening of someone who has made a decision and is now defending it rather than reconsidering it. "Sir, I've explained the situation. Customer service can discuss further options after the flight. Right now, boarding is closing, and I need you to proceed to your assigned seats." The line behind Ray had stopped moving. Not dramatically, just the gradual collective stilling of people who had registered that something was happening and had decided individually and almost simultaneously to observe it while appearing not to. Ray looked at Lily. She was watching the exchange with the quiet, focused attention that children brought to adult conflict, understanding the shape and temperature of it before they understood the content. Her hand tightened slightly around his sleeve. He crouched down to her level. The gate noise receded slightly. The line, the attendant, the boarding passes, all of it moved to the periphery. He looked at his daughter's face, the paleness under the terminal lights. The left ear slightly turned, the unconscious habit she'd developed after the surgery. Captain the rabbit secured under her arm. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Are the big seats gone?" He adjusted the strap of her backpack, smoothed the collar of the yellow sweater, held her gaze for a moment and found in it the thing that was always there, the complete, unquestioning trust that was simultaneously the most sustaining and the most demanding thing in his life. "Maybe for a minute," he said. "Just hold, Captain." She pulled the rabbit closer. "Okay." He stood. Something had reorganized in him during those few seconds at her level. Not anger, never anger in situations like this, Because anger was the thing institutions designed conflicts to produce. Because anger made people imprecise, and imprecision made documentation challengeable and challengeable. Documentation was how legitimate grievances became manageable emotional incidents. Not the hot reactive thing, something cooler. The specific, professional clarity of a man who had spent 30 years documenting exactly how institutional failures happened and was watching one happen in real time, and recognized it not as a personal affront, but as a process, a documentable, reportable, consequential process that had started the moment Sandra Pruitt looked at him and categorized him as someone who would accept the lesser outcome without creating a record. He looked at Sandra Pruitt. "I'd like the reason for the reassignment in writing," he said. Her expression shifted. Not anger, something more calculated. The look of someone reassessing the difficulty of a situation they had expected to close quickly. "That isn't standard procedure, sir. It is when a documented medical accommodation has been overridden without safety justification. I'd also like your full name." The pause that followed was brief but had texture. "My name is on my badge," she said. Her voice had dropped slightly, not for privacy, but into the register people used when they wanted a conversation to end without the social cost of ending it directly. "So it is," Ray said. He read it. Sandra Pruitt. He did not write it down. He did not need to. 31 years of processing information had left him with a memory that held what it needed to hold. Grant Ellison stepped forward. He did it the way men of his type step forward, not aggressively, but with the casual assumption that his movement through space was appropriate and would be accommodated. He directed his attention past Ray and toward Sandra Pruitt with the specific quality of a man who had learned to address the person with power over an obstacle rather than the obstacle itself. "Is there going to be a significant delay?" he asked. "We have an early morning in Chicago." Ray looked at him. Grant Ellison did not look back, not from deliberate rudeness, but because Ray was in his operational category, part of the environment. A feature of the gate area causing delay, not a person withstanding in the conversation. Ray said, "Were you offered these seats or were they assigned to you?" Grant Ellison's gaze came to Ray now with the mild irritation of someone whose peripheral furniture has unexpectedly addressed them. "I'm sorry. Were you told," Ray said with the specific patience of someone stating something once and meaning to state it exactly once, "that the seats you're in were already assigned to a child with a documented medical accommodation?" The question did what a raised voice would not have done. It was specific. It was quiet. It placed a fact on a record without requiring a formal record to exist. Grant Ellison's expression moved through several rapid adjustments, irritation giving way to something more cautious, then settling into the particular dismissal of a man who had learned in boardrooms to close lines of inquiry that complicated his position. "I requested the service level I'm entitled to," he said. "What the airline does after that isn't my concern." Ray nodded once. "That answers it." Grant Ellison frowned. He had expected argument or retreat and received neither. He stepped back. Sandra Pruitt straightened. "Sir, I need a decision. Your assigned seats or I involve the captain." Ray looked at her with the patience of someone who understood that this moment was not an endpoint, but a stage, the escalation to the level where the decision could be properly documented and properly attributed. "Please do," he said. 2 words, delivered without emphasis, without performance, without any of the tonal signals that people use to communicate that they understood they were in a confrontation and were either afraid of it or energized by it. Sandra Pruitt had 14 years in the job. She had handled the full range of what airports and pressurized cabins and delayed connections and cramped seats did to the full range of human temperament. She had a system for all of it, a reliable system, and the system worked because it was built around a reliable truth. Most people, when confronted with institutional authority deployed with confidence and volume, eventually found a way to accept the outcome. Not because they were wrong, because they were tired or embarrassed or aware of the 100 people behind them, or simply didn't know the specific language with which to make their objection legible to the system. The man in front of her was not performing any of the expected behaviors. He had not raised his voice. He had not made an appeal to fairness in the abstract. He had not threatened. He had not wept. He had simply stood there with a child beside him and asked for things by their correct procedural names in the correct procedural order, with the specific and quiet precision of someone who understood not just what to ask for, but why the asking mattered. That was more unsettling than anything else. She turned and went back into the cabin. Lily looked up at Ray. "Are we in trouble?" He rested his hand lightly on her shoulder. She was looking at him with the exhausted trust of a 7-year-old who had spent 11 days in a hospital and had been trying with considerable success to be braver than a 7-year-old should have to be. "No," he said. He meant it the way he meant everything he said to her, with the specific weight of having considered whether he could stand behind it before he said it. He opened his briefcase. The motion was ordinary, the everyday motion of a man accessing something he needed. The briefcase opened smoothly and he lifted out the main folder. The pages were crisp, the tabs were color-coded and precise, and the formatting of the documentation was the formatting that anyone with a background in federal aviation compliance would recognize immediately, not because it was proprietary, but because it was the standard that Ray's division had established and that had since been adopted as the baseline across the regulatory framework. What he did not remove from the briefcase, but what anyone looking carefully at the open case could have seen, was the form resting beneath the folder. FAA Form 910-C, Accommodation Compliance Incident Report. It was partially completed, not in the way a form was filled out in the heat of a grievance, in the way a form was prepared by someone who had learned over 3 decades that the gap between policy and practice had a way of materializing in specific documentable moments, and that being ready to document those moments was not pessimism, but professionalism. The form had today's date at the top. It had the flight number. It had the carrier name. Continental Airways. The lines for incident description, staff identification, and authorization chain were still blank. For now. Ray closed the briefcase. He took out his phone, opened the message application, and found the contact he was looking for. He typed 11 words, read them once to confirm they said exactly what he intended them to say, and sent them. He put the phone away. The contact name on the sent message read S. Hoffman Operations. Stan Hoffman was 60 years old. He had spent the first part of his career as an FAA operations liaison, the kind of role that required understanding both the regulatory framework and the operational realities of the people who were supposed to implement it, and the specific tensions between those two things. He had gone into airport administration 20 years ago and had risen through the combination of competence and patience that large institutions eventually rewarded, to the position of Director of Airport Operations at Chicago O'Hare. He and Ray had worked together on 3 major compliance reviews in the 1990s. They had not been close friends exactly. Both were too internally precise for the kind of friendship that required frequent maintenance, but they were the kind of colleagues who had developed over years of shared work on difficult problems, the ability to communicate without extensive preamble. They understood each other's professional language. They trusted each other's judgment in the specific, evidence-based way that people trusted judgment when they had seen it applied under pressure. Ray had not contacted him in 2 years. He was not contacting him now to ask for rescue. He was contacting him because Stan Hoffman was the operations director at the destination airport, and because what was occurring at Gate B14 of Boston. Logan was, in precise regulatory terms, a documented accommodation compliance failure involving a carrier under an active partnership agreement with specific binding obligations regarding medical accommodation protocols. Stan Hoffman was someone who would understand exactly what that sentence meant and exactly what it required. The message was 11 words: compliance event in progress, Continental BOS to ORD, will update on landing. Not a request, not a plea, a notification. The kind of notification that regulatory frameworks were designed to receive and respond to from the kind of source that regulatory frameworks were designed to take seriously. Captain Douglas Merritt arrived 4 minutes later. He was 55 years old, broad-shouldered and straight-postured, with the pressed uniform and the deliberate measured stride of a man who had spent nearly 3 decades being the most authoritative presence in whatever room he entered, and had long since internalized that authority as a natural condition rather than an earned one. He moved through the gate area with the unhurried certainty of someone who expected situations to resolve themselves when he arrived, because in his experience they did. He did not introduce himself. He looked at Ray, then at the waiting line, then at Sandra Pruitt beside him, and made the rapid categorical assessment of someone who had already determined the conclusion before examining the evidence. Ray recognized this. He had documented it many times. Sir Merritt said, "I understand there's a seating dispute." Ray registered the word, dispute. not accommodation failure, not reassignment error. Dispute a word that distributed responsibility evenly between parties, which was both tactically useful to Merritt and factually inaccurate, in which Ray filed accordingly. There is a documented medical accommodation that has been overridden without safety justification, Ray said. My daughter and I were booked in business class with a medical note on the reservation. Those seats were given to other passengers. The reason offered was partner accommodation, not mechanical, not safety-related, not weight or balance. Status-based. Merritt's expression remained professionally steady. The crew made an operational decision during a high-demand boarding period. I'm confirming it. On what authority? On my authority as the operating captain of this aircraft. Does your authority as operating captain extend to overriding documented pediatric medical accommodations for non-safety status-based reasons? The pause was longer than the previous one. Grant Ellison, still nearby, produced a sound that was not quite a word, the audible exhale of someone whose patience had crossed into contempt. Diane Ellison had lowered her sunglasses slightly and was watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone beginning to sense that the familiar resolution of these situations might not apply here. Merritt stepped slightly forward. His voice remained level, but it carried the particular weight of someone unaccustomed to having his operational domain questioned by someone standing on the wrong side of the aircraft door. Sir, I am asking you one final time to proceed to your assigned seats so we can complete boarding and depart on schedule. Lily had settled onto the small fold-out seat near the galley entrance. She had Captain in her lap and both hands wrapped around the rabbit's midsection. She was watching the adults with the quiet, serious, unblinking attention of a child who had spent too much time in rooms where adults discussed things that affected her over her head and had learned that the only way to understand what was happening was to watch very carefully. Ray looked at her. He allowed himself the full look, not the peripheral awareness he'd been maintaining, but the direct, unguarded look at his daughter sitting on the small fold-out seat with her rabbit and her yellow sweater and her left ear turned slightly away from the noise. Then he looked back at Captain Douglas Merritt. I'd like your full name for the formal record, he said, and I'd like written confirmation that you are personally authorizing the override of a documented pediatric medical accommodation for non-safety status-based reasons. The gate area went quiet. Not silent. The terminal continued its institutional hum behind them. The departure boards continued their patient blinking somewhere down the concourse. An announcement was being made in the cheerful register that airport announcements required. But the immediate space around Gate B14 had gone quiet in the particular way of spaces where something was happening that could not be taken back once it had proceeded further. Captain Merritt stared at Ray with the expression of a man who had encountered something that did not match his operational template. He had come to the gate expecting one of the recognizable shapes that passenger resistance took volume desperation, an emotional appeal to fairness, the cracking point that would allow the situation to be managed. He had encountered none of these things. He had encountered a quiet man who asked for things by their correct names and did not perform any of the behaviors that authority had been trained to manage. If you do not proceed to your assigned seats, Merritt said, placing each word with the deliberateness of someone who wanted witnesses to remember them, I will request airport security and you will be removed from this flight. Lily stood at the word removed. She stood up from the fold-out seat without drama, the way children stood when something they had been hoping would resolve itself had stopped resolving itself. Her hand found Ray's. He looked down at her, squeezed her hand once gently with the specific pressure that meant, I have this. This is all right, you are safe. Then he looked at Captain Douglas Merritt. No performance, no escalation. The steady, worn stillness of a 58-year-old man who had buried his wife, raised his daughter alone through surgery and treatment, and 11 days of testing in Boston, spent 30 years watching institutions fail the people they were built to protect, and built his second career on the principle that the gap between what policy said and what actually happened was not abstract. It was a seat on a specific aircraft on a Friday night that a 7-year-old girl with a repaired ear needed in order to get home without pain. Call them, Ray said. Merritt waited for the crack, the breaking point, the emotional moment that would reset the dynamic and return the situation to familiar territory. It did not come. Only stillness, and a father who did not move. The captain turned sharply and walked back into the aircraft. Sandra Pruitt followed. The jet bridge door closed. Ray sat back down beside Lily. He settled her against his side, felt the specific weight of her leaning into him, and opened his briefcase. He removed the FAA form. He began filling in the incident description lines. Lily watched him write for a moment. "What's that?" she asked quietly. "Paperwork." "Is it important?" He kept writing, precise and unhurried. "It will be," he said. Outside the terminal glass, under the white floodlights on the tarmac, Continental Flight 1847 to Chicago sat waiting. Ground crew completed their checks. The machinery of departure had prepared itself entirely. It would not depart for some time yet. And on the executive stand, 3 terminals to the north, a sleek white aircraft belonging to Callaway Compliance Group sat exactly where it had been parked 2 hours before, its navigation lights blinking, with the patient, unhurried regularity of something that was waiting for a call that had not yet been made. The jet bridge door closed and the gate area became a waiting room. Not by announcement. No gate agent stepped to the podium and explained the delay. The departure board continued its lie of punctuality, as departure boards did, optimistic long past the point of accuracy, because the boards served the management of expectations rather than the communication of facts. But everyone at Gate B14 understood, with the collective wordless comprehension of people trapped in the same confined space, watching the same unresolved situation, that the ordinary machinery of boarding had stopped. And the reason it had stopped was sitting near the window with a child against his arm and a pen moving steadily across a government form. Ray finished the first section of the FAA report and moved to the second. He did not rush. Rushing produced errors, and errors produced documentation that could be challenged on technical grounds rather than substantive ones. And he had seen too many legitimate complaints dismissed because the person who filed them had been too angry to be precise. Anger was what institutions counted on. It made people imprecise. It made their records vulnerable. It converted legitimate grievances into emotional disturbances, which were categorically easier to manage than documented compliance failures, which created files, which created reviews, which created the kind of institutional friction that people would pay significant amounts to avoid. Ray was not angry. He was something colder and more permanent than anger. He had found over the years that the emotion closest to what he felt in these situations was not anger, but its opposite. A specific, focused patience, the kind that came from understanding exactly how something worked and exactly what it would take to make it work differently, and being entirely willing to supply that thing regardless of how long it took or how uncomfortable it made the people around him. Lily sat beside him, leaning against his arm. She had stopped asking questions, which meant she had either fallen asleep or had decided, in the way she sometimes did, to simply trust the silence. He hoped it was both. The cracker packet that had appeared on the seat beside them, placed there by the older woman with the gray hair and the sensible coat, and the paperback she was no longer reading, placed there without comment or eye contact, which was the correct way to offer help to a stranger who was managing something difficult, sat in Lily's hands. She held it with both hands, the way she held things when she was uncertain what they required of her. Ray was aware of everything in the gate area without appearing to watch any of it. Grant Ellison had moved to the far end of the seating area and was on his phone. His posture communicated what his voice held low, did not broadcast the controlled urgency of a man managing a situation he had not planned for. Diane Ellison sat 2 seats away from him, maintaining the performance of indifference that had clearly become, over the course of the evening, increasingly effortful. The gate agent Pam typed at the podium with the concentrated focus of someone executing instructions whose full significance she did not entirely understand. 2 younger passengers near the back of the line had their phones out at waist height, angled upward. Recording. They were doing it carefully, which meant they understood that what they were documenting might matter. The older woman with the paperback was not reading it. She was watching Ray with the open, settled attention of someone who had decided this was worth understanding. Ray capped his pen and looked out the window. The tarmac at night had its own specific quality, floodlit and purposeful, stripped of the romance that daylight gave to airports. Ground vehicles moved in their established patterns. A baggage train curved around a neighboring aircraft's nose. A fuel truck sat idle at the apron's edge. And on the executive stand, 3 terminals to the north. The Callaway Compliance Group aircraft sat exactly where it had been parked when Ray arrived. Its navigation lights blinked with the patient, regular pulse of something that had no reason to hurry because no one had given it reason to move. Ray looked at it. Then he looked away and set the pen down and allowed himself, for the first time since the confrontation at the aircraft door, to be still in a way that was not performance. The controlled stillness he projected outward was a deliberate posture. He was precise about this, honest with himself about what it required. It was not natural calm. It was constructed calm, built from the same materials as everything else he had built since Margaret died. From the understanding that falling apart was a luxury he could not afford, because Lily needed him to hold together, and from the further understanding that holding together under pressure was not the same as being unaffected by it. His right hand resting on his knee was not entirely steady. He looked at it, the slight tension in the tendons across the back of it, the nearly imperceptible tremor that arrived when he had been holding himself in for a long time. He exhaled slowly, longer than the breaths before it, the deliberate exhale of someone releasing pressure that had accumulated past the point of comfortable containment. This was what it cost. Not the confrontation itself, not the standing still while a captain leveraged his authority and a flight attendant deployed her system and a businessman spoke around him as though he were furniture. That part was navigable. He had done versions of it in federal depositions and congressional briefings, and the quiet, consequential meetings in airline boardrooms where his team's findings were unwelcome, and people who were accustomed to managing inconvenient information had tried various approaches to making it go away. The composure in those rooms had never cracked. It had not cracked tonight, but it cost something. Every time it cost something specific and real, and the thing it cost was the energy required to remain himself precisely, completely himself, under circumstances designed to make that difficult. He let himself think about Margaret. He let himself think about her the way he rarely did outside of the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning when the controls he kept during daylight hours became harder to maintain. She had been the person who understood him without requiring him to explain himself, which was the rarest kind of understanding, and the kind he had not known he relied on until it was gone. She had known that his stillness was not distance, that what looked like detachment was the opposite, a form of attention so concentrated that it needed containment or it would become overwhelming. She had known when to talk to him and when to sit beside him in silence, and she had possessed with an ease that still seemed miraculous to him the ability to distinguish between those moments without being told. She had been 49 years old. She had been in their kitchen on a Tuesday morning in November, making coffee in the particular unhurried way she made it on mornings when she had nowhere to be before 10. Lily had been at kindergarten. Ray had been in Washington in the preparation phase of a deposition for an investigation that his team had spent 14 months completing. The investigation concerned an airline that had falsified maintenance records on 17 aircraft over 4 years. The documentation was complete, accurate and correct in every particular. It had been submitted through proper channels on a Monday morning. It had entered an administrative queue and remained there for 11 days. Not because of malice, not because of suppression, because queues existed, because backlogs happened, because 11 days was within the normal operational tolerance of administrative processing systems that had not been designed to account for what might happen in those 11 days to the people whose safety the documentation was meant to protect. Ray needed to be clear about this, even in the privacy of his own thinking. Margaret's death had no connection to that report, that queue, or those 11 days. Her heart stopped because hearts sometimes stopped. It had nothing to do with the airline, the falsified records, the administrative backlog. He knew this. He had known it from the first moment of the first grief-destroyed day, and knowing it had not changed anything about the weight of the number 11 in his accounting of things. Because 11 days was the measure of the gap. Not that gap specifically, not the queue that had held that particular report. The gap in general. The gap that existed in every system between what it was designed to do and what it actually did under the ordinary pressures of volume and time and competing priorities. The gap that was in the abstract, manageable, and within tolerance, and not worth stopping a process over. The gap that was in the particular everything. He had left the FAA 10 months after Margaret died, after nearly a year of understanding gradually, and then completely. That staying was a different kind of failure than leaving. He had built Callaway Compliance Group from a 2-room Lincoln Park office with a staff of 7 people who understood the work and cared about it, and in 3 years the company had become precisely what he had intended it to become. Small enough to be honest, experienced enough to be credible, and positioned close enough to the edge of the system to see clearly where it bent. Continental Airways, 14 months ago, a 4-month audit, a thorough report, a signed partnership agreement with the compliance framework. Ray's framework, his team's language, his years of understanding what Gates actually did under pressure, attached as a binding operational condition. He looked at Lily now. She had fallen asleep against his arm, the cracker packet still held loosely in both hands. Captain the rabbit pressed between her knees and her chest. Her face in sleep carried the complete undefended openness of a child who trusted where she was. The yellow sweater rose and fell with her breathing. Her left ear, the repaired one, the one that Dr. Voss had spent 3 days assessing, the one that was the reason they had been in Boston for 11 days, was turned slightly away from him. The unconscious habit she'd developed since June, though the surgeon said the position made no physical difference, it made a difference to Lily. That was sufficient. Ray adjusted her sweater collar without waking her. This was the center of everything. Not principle, not professional obligation, not the procedural satisfaction of making a correct record, though the record mattered and he would make it regardless. Her, the specific, irreplaceable weight of her against his arm, trusting completely that the seat she had been promised would be there when she woke up because her father had said it would be, and her father did not say things were true when they were not. He picked up the pen. Officer Bridget Farrow arrived at Gate B 11 minutes after the jet bridge door had closed. She came with a younger officer named Garrett, who moved with the careful attentiveness of someone in the earlier part of his career, still in the phase where everything required deliberate processing rather than trained reflex. Farrow was 43 with the posture of someone who had done something physical before this job and had kept the physical habits afterward. Her eyes moved over the gate area, the way experienced eyes moved, collecting the whole room before landing on any particular part of it. She found Ray without needing to ask anyone for direction, which Ray noted and filed. The description she'd been given was evidently more specific than difficult passenger in the boarding area. She approached and introduced herself without performance. Officer Bridget Farrow, Airport Security. Sir, I've been asked to respond to a boarding dispute at this gate. Ray stood. Ray Calloway. He left it there. Farrow's eyes moved briefly to Lily, still asleep against the repositioned armrest, then to the briefcase, then to the open folder on top of it, then to the form beside the folder. She looked at the form for a fraction of a second longer than she looked at anything else. "May I review the documentation?" she asked. Ray handed her the folder. She read it with the deliberate attention of someone who intended to understand what they were reading, not perform understanding of it. She turned to the second page, read Dr. Voss's note with its precise clinical language, the heading from Boston Children's Hospital, the specific description of pressure sensitivity mechanism, the explicit recommendation for front cabin seating, and then turned back to the first page. She looked at the formatting of the accommodation documentation. Ray watched her look at it. "Did you prepare this yourself?" she asked, not looking up from the page. "I trained the people who wrote the formatting standard," he said. Farrow looked up. Her expression did not change, but something behind it reorganized slightly, a small adjustment of the internal picture she had been forming. She closed the folder and held it briefly before returning it. "For my records, sir," she said, her voice lower now, professional rather than procedural, the register of someone who was doing their job carefully rather than covering it. "Are you currently refusing to board or requesting resolution before boarding?" "I'm requesting documented justification for the override of a medical accommodation before placing my daughter in an environment her physician has specifically flagged as risky," Farrow wrote in her notebook. Garrett beside her moved to stand near the jet bridge entrance, not as a threat, but as someone understanding where the relevant positions were. "Do you have the physician's note available?" Ray produced it. Farrow read it, made a notation, returned it. She asked for the booking confirmation showing the original business class assignment. He produced that as well. She wrote the flight number and booking reference in her notebook with the care of someone who understood that details recorded correctly now saved significant effort later. She asked her final question quietly enough that only Ray could hear it clearly. "Mr. Calloway, for clarity, are you pursuing resolution for tonight or for afterward as well?" It was a better question than its surface suggested. Ray had been on the other side of this question many times, had asked versions of it himself in his professional life, because it was the question that separated the people who wanted immediate comfort from the people who intended structural accountability. Systems had learned to offer immediate comfort because it was cost-effective. A voucher, an apology, a seat restored, a file closed. Most people accepted it, not because they were wrong, but because they were tired or embarrassed by the public nature of the dispute, or because they did not know that accepting comfort without documentation meant the next person would encounter the same gap with no record that it had been identified. "Both," Ray said. Farrow wrote that down without comment. It was the right answer, and she knew it. Grant Ellison had ended his phone call. He stood now with the phone in his hand, watching the exchange between Ray and the security officer with the expression of a man whose calculation of the situation was undergoing significant revision. He had seen these situations before, had been in airports during countless boarding delays, had watched passengers dispute seat assignments and upgrades and carry-on policies. He knew the shape these things took. The resistant passenger, the security response, the quiet or not so quiet removal, the flight departing with the remaining passengers relieved and slightly self-righteous about not having been the difficult one. This was not taken in that shape. Grant Ellison looked out the terminal window. Ray knew exactly what he was looking at. The aircraft on the executive stand had not moved. Its navigation lights blinked with the patience of something that had no schedule to keep because no one had told it to keep one. Grant's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the slight recalibration of a man who understood leverage and had just felt the pressure change. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at Ray's briefcase. He looked at Ray. He said nothing. Diane Ellison had removed her sunglasses. She was watching Lily. Lily woke up. She did it the way she always woke, gradually, like a tide coming in, opening her eyes in stages rather than all at once. She sat up, blinking, and looked at the gate area with the systematic attention she brought to waking up in unfamiliar situations. The security officers, the gate agent at the podium, the flight attendant visible through the jet bridge door's small window, her father. She settled on her father. "Daddy," she said, "I'm here. I don't feel good." The words were small, entirely without theater. The plain, tired statement of a 7-year-old who had been trying very hard to hold herself together and had simply run out of trying the way containers eventually ran out regardless of their capacity. Her face had gone pale, the specific pale Ray recognized from the assessments, the quiet withdrawal of color that preceded the pressure-related nausea Dr. Voss had documented. The ear pressure responding to accumulated fatigue and stress and terminal air, and the particular anxiety of watching adults in uniforms argue about her in language she mostly understood. Ray was beside her without rushing, present in the complete way he had learned to be present, which meant without reservation or distraction. "Okay," he said. "Sit still. Don't turn your head." He had the anti-nausea tablets out of the briefcase's outer pocket before he finished the sentence. The small labeled Ziploc always in the same pocket, always accessible without searching. He opened it, produced a tablet, gave it to her with the water bottle. "Small sip," he said. "That's all." She took it, leaned against him, closed her eyes. Ray looked up. Diane Ellison was watching with an expression that had moved past the performance of indifference into something that didn't have a clean category label. Not guilt, something less defined than guilt. The look of someone whose position has become untenable, not because of argument, but because of a specific undeniable image that has bypassed all the arguments. She looked at her husband. Grant Ellison had not looked away from Lily. He was completely still, phone at his side, and his face had done something Ray had not anticipated and did not immediately know what to do with. It had gone quiet in the way a room went quiet when something entered it that displaced everything else. The particular quiet of someone who had been temporarily removed from their usual operating context by something that cut past the habits in the calculation. Grant Ellison was looking at a 7-year-old girl with a repaired ear, in a yellow sweater and a stuffed rabbit missing a button, sitting pale against her father in an airport gate. And something in that specific image had reached past the board meeting and the connection delay and the 30 years of accumulated habit that told him his time was worth more than the time of the people around him. He blinked. He looked away. He did not speak. He did not gesture or offer anything. But he took one step back, and he sat down, and he put his phone in his pocket, and he did not make another call. Diane Ellison sat down beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Ray observed this without appearing to observe it. He had learned over many years that the most revealing information about people was not what they did while they knew they were being watched, but what they did in the half-second before they remembered that they were. In that half-second, Grant Ellison had been a person who remembered something private and difficult. Ray didn't know what. He didn't need to know. It had changed the temperature of the room by a small but measurable amount, and that was enough. Carol Stanton arrived from the operations corridor with the specific energy of someone who had been given a problem larger than her usual inventory and was carrying it with professional composure that was costing her visible effort. She was the gate operations supervisor. Ray had inferred this from the way Pam at the podium straightened when she appeared and from the particular authority with which she moved through the space. She introduced herself. She spoke to Ray with the careful register of a person who had been told to resolve something and had not yet been given the parameters of resolution. Mr. Calloway, I want to make sure we find a path forward here. I appreciate that, Ray said. He meant it precisely as much as the situation warranted. If we can restore your original seats, are they currently available? She hesitated. 1 second. It was 1 second too long. At the moment those passengers are seated, then the reassignment was a choice, Ray said. The way you stated a conclusion, without inflection, without argument. Not an operational necessity. I'd like that on the record. Stanton looked at him carefully. Then she moved to the podium and typed. Ray watched her hands the query, the pause, the second query. Her posture shifted fractionally, the postural shift of someone whose screen had returned information that reorganized their understanding of what they were managing. She picked up the phone, turned slightly away. Ray caught fragments, operations hold request executive stand. She put the phone down. When she turned back, her expression had been reconstructed. Mr. Calloway, she said carefully with the specific precision of someone choosing words under conditions that had changed since they last spoke. Have you been in contact with anyone at the destination airport? An old colleague, Ray said. In what capacity? We worked together at the FAA for several years. He's now in operations management at O'Hare. Stanton typed one more query. Ray could not see the screen from his angle, but he could read her face, which was considerably more legible than she likely intended. Her eyes moved across whatever the screen showed. They stopped. She looked at Ray. She looked back at the screen. She turned the monitor slightly away from Ray's line of sight and made another call, this one longer, in a voice too low to hear. Captain Merritt reappeared at the jet bridge door. He had been watching through the portal window. Ray had been aware of this throughout. Merritt stepped out into the gate area with the controlled determination of a man who had committed to a position on principle and was maintaining it because reversing it would require a kind of accounting he was not yet ready to perform. He walked to the podium and spoke to Stanton in a voice low enough for privacy, but too tense for actual composure. How much longer, he said. Stanton answered in a murmur Ray could not make out. Merritt's jaw tightened. He turned toward Ray, opening his mouth for what Ray recognized would be another version of the authority argument, the captain's final word, the operational necessity of departure, the binary of compliance or removal. Daddy, my ear hurts. Lily said it matter-of-factly without drama, the way children reported pain when they hadn't yet learned that adults behave strangely in response to it. Ray turned to her. Which side? The left one. He touched her jaw lightly just below the ear. She winced barely, but he felt it. He nodded once, the nod of a man receiving information he had been expecting. He looked at Farrow, who had remained in position nearby throughout. Officer, for the record, my daughter is currently experiencing pressure-related ear discomfort, consistent with her documented sensitivity in a non-pressurized terminal environment as a direct result of the stress and duration of this interaction. Farrow wrote it down. Beside her, Garrett made a note as well. She will experience significantly greater discomfort in a pressurized cabin seated in row 28, Ray continued. Farrow wrote that down too. Merritt said, Mr. Calloway. Captain Merritt, Ray said, and the use of the full name and title delivered without hostility, but with absolute precision, produced a half-beat pause. I am not refusing to fly. I am refusing to place my daughter in documented medical risk because a member of your crew decided that our seats were more conveniently used for a status passenger than for a child with a physician's note. These are categorically different things, and I would like the record to reflect that distinction. The gate area had gone very quiet. Even the terminal's background noise seemed to have reduced itself, as though the building had the decency to lower its voice. The two younger passengers with their phones had stopped trying to be discreet. The older woman had closed her paperback. Pam at the podium was staring at her screen with the focused blankness of someone who wanted very much to be somewhere else. Sandra Pruitt had come out of the jet bridge doorway. She stood with her arms crossed, not looking at Ray, looking at Merritt. Something passed between them, not words, just the silent vocabulary of two people who had made a shared decision and were discovering it may have been the wrong one. Stanton's phone rang. She answered, listened, said two words, understood, and yes, and ended the call. She looked at the gate area with the expression of someone whose understanding of their own situation had just been significantly revised. "Mr. Calloway," she said carefully, "Operations has flagged a movement hold on this flight." Merritt turned to her sharply. "On what basis?" She kept her eyes on Ray. "Corridor conflict, executive stand, clearance pending." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. Previous silences had been the silences of people waiting for a situation to resolve. This silence was the silence of people understanding that a situation had grown larger than the space they had assumed contained it. Grant Ellison stood up. He looked out the window at the executive stand, at the white aircraft with its patient blinking lights, at Ray's briefcase, at Ray. He sat back down slowly, and for the first time since they had occupied the same space, Grant Ellison looked like a man who was not certain of the ground beneath him. Captain Merritt asked Ray directly with the strained control of a man maintaining authority by effort rather than condition. "Is that aircraft connected to you?" Ray looked at him. "It belongs to my company. You're holding this flight." "I have made no calls regarding that aircraft's movement," Ray said. This was true, and he stated it precisely because precision was what the moment required. "It is parked where it was parked when I arrived. If that creates an operational corridor conflict, that is a question for airport operations." He paused. "What I have done is notify an operations contact that a compliance event was in progress on this flight. What occurs as a result of that notification is above both our pay grades." From the far end of the terminal corridor, three figures in airport operations uniforms appeared. They walked with the measured, unhurried pace of people for whom authority was a condition rather than a performance. The one in front was 60 years old, silver-haired, broad across the shoulders, with the specific quality of stillness that Ray recognized because he had spent years among people who had it. The stillness of someone who had stopped needing to perform competence because they had accumulated enough of the real thing to make performance unnecessary. Stan Hoffman. He entered Gate B14 without announcement or theater and did what experienced people did when they entered unfamiliar rooms, gathered the whole of it before acting in any part of it. His eyes moved across the gate area with systematic efficiency. The passengers Pam at the podium, Stanton Merritt Farrow, and Garrett the Ellisons. Then they found Ray. They stopped there. Stan Hoffman looked at Ray Calloway for a long moment with the recognition of a man who understood precisely what he was looking at. Not a difficult passenger, not a compliance incident in the abstract, but a specific person whose work he knew and whose professional judgment he had learned over many years of working alongside it to take seriously without qualification. He nodded. Not a greeting nod, not the nod of a superior acknowledging a subordinate. The other kind, the nod between equals who have developed over years of shared work on difficult problems, the ability to communicate significant things without requiring extensive preamble. Ray nodded back. Captain Merritt, standing 3 feet away, watched this exchange with the expression of a man whose understanding of the room's hierarchy had just been substantially and permanently revised. Hoffman spoke first to Stanton. "Carol, give me the gate report." Then to Merritt. "Captain, I'll need a full account of the accommodation decision from initial assignment through the current moment." Then, without raising his voice to the room in general, "Nobody moves until I've reviewed everything." He crossed to where Ray and Lily were sitting. Lily looked up at this large, silver-haired man who had entered the room and changed its pressure without raising his voice. She looked at her father. "It's all right," Ray said quietly. Hoffman looked at Lily for a moment, with the patient ease of a man who had grandchildren, and understood that important conversations sometimes happened at a child's eye level and were better for it. Then he looked at Ray. "Ray," he said. "Stan," Ray said. 2 syllables each. "Everything necessary." Hoffman looked at the FAA form on the folder. He looked at Ray's face, the specific tiredness that Ray had stopped concealing, the particular quality of exhaustion that came from 11 days of hospitals and the work of holding yourself completely together for someone who needed you to. He looked at Lily in the yellow sweater. He said very quietly for Ray, and perhaps Lily alone, "You should have called me sooner." "I was handling it," Ray said. Hoffman almost smiled. "I know you were." He straightened. His voice returned to its operational register. "That's the problem." He turned and walked to the podium where Stanton was waiting with the gate report, and Gate B14 settled permanently and quietly into a new configuration, the way things settled when the person who understood the situation best finally arrived and made that understanding visible. Grant Ellison looked at his phone. He put it in his pocket. He looked out at the executive stand one more time, looked at Ray and said nothing. He did not need to. Outside under the floodlights, the Callaway Compliance Group aircraft sat and blinked. Patient, unhurried, waiting like its owner for the system to catch up to what had already been true for quite some time. Stan Hoffman read everything. He read the gate report that Carol Stanton handed him, standing at the podium, with 2 operations staff positioned behind him and Captain Merritt 3 feet to his left. He read every page of Lily's medical folder, not the summary, not the cover sheet, but each page in sequence, turning them with the deliberate attention of someone for whom documents were evidence rather than formality. He read the accommodation note from Dr. Voss, with its Boston Children's Hospital letterhead and its precise clinical language about pressure, sensitivity mechanisms, and front cabin seating recommendations. He read the booking confirmation showing the original business class assignment and its date 3 months prior. He read the incident notes that Officer Bridget Farrow had taken, which were chronological and specific, and reflected well on no one at the gate except the passenger who had requested them. He read the FAA Form 910-C that Ray had partially completed. He held that one longer than the others. Then he set the folder down on the podium, straightened, and looked at the gate area with the expression of a man who had walked from the operations center, hoping the situation would be less clear-cut than the preliminary report suggested, and who had been fully disappointed in that hope. He turned to Captain Merritt, who authorized the accommodation override. Merritt maintained his posture. The cabin crew made the assignment adjustment during departure pressure. I confirmed it when I arrived at the gate, before or after reviewing the medical file. A pause, 1 second, then a second one. After, Merritt said. Hoffman looked at him steadily. After you had already confirmed it. It was not a question. Merritt understood this and said nothing, which was the only available response for a man who had just heard his own timeline, stated plainly in front of people who were writing things down. Hoffman turned to Sandra Pruitt, who stood near the jet bridge entrance with her arms at her sides and the expression of someone who had spent the last several minutes preparing for a conversation and had not in all that preparation found a version of it that resolved comfortably. You approved the reassignment, Hoffman said. I was contacted by the partner accommodation desk, Sandra said. She delivered it professionally with the evenness of someone who had decided that accuracy was the only viable posture remaining. The Ellisons' connection had been delayed through our partner network. The partner accommodation protocol, Hoffman said with the quiet precision of someone reading a standard, back to the person who has misapplied it, authorizes preferential seating upgrades when equivalent, alternative seating is available, and when no documented accommodation conflicts exist. He paused. Walk me through how that protocol applies to what happened here. Sandra Pruitt looked at the folder on the podium. She looked at Ray. She looked at Hoffman. I was aware there was a medical notation on the reservation, she said, but you completed the reassignment. I assessed that row 28 provided adequate. Ms. Pruitt. Hoffman's voice did not rise. It simply stopped her the way a precise hand signal stopped movement. A physician at Boston Children's Hospital documented a specific medical requirement for this child. You are a senior flight attendant. You substituted your assessment of row 28 for a physician's documented recommendation because a status passenger wanted a more comfortable seat. He allowed that to exist in the air for a moment, where everyone present could examine it from whatever angle they chose. I want to confirm we're describing the same event. Sandra Pruitt said nothing. Ray sat beside Lily and listened to the exchange with the detached attention of a man who had been on the other side of these conversations many times, who had been the one asking the questions, reading the documentation, watching the person on the other side of the table decide how much to acknowledge. There was no satisfaction in this moment. He wanted to be honest about that. There was something, the specific, quiet release of something that had been misnamed for too long, finally being named correctly, but it was not satisfaction. Satisfaction implied an ending. This was not an ending. This was a stage. Lily was awake beside him, sitting quietly with Captain in her lap, working through the cracker packet with the careful small bites of a child who had learned in clinical settings to eat deliberately when her stomach was uncertain. Her color had improved since the tablet. She was listening to the adults. She always listened to the adults with the patient, systematic attention of someone gathering information she understood was about her. Ray put his arm around her and she leaned into it without pausing her cracker. Hoffman walked over. He sat down in the chair on the other side of Lily, which produced a small collective surprise in the gate area. Operations directors managed from standing. They moved between focal points. They did not sit down beside 7-year-olds in airport gate seats. Stan Hoffman sat down and looked at Lily with the easy, unhurried patience of a man who had grandchildren and understood that some of the most important conversations in a life happened when you got down to someone's level and stayed there. "What's your rabbit's name?" he asked. Lily assessed him, the careful look she brought to strangers she wasn't sure about yet. "Then Captain? Good name for a rabbit. He's missing a button." Hoffman examined the rabbit's face with appropriate gravity. "Which one?" "The left one, same side as my ear." "Does it bother him?" Lily considered this with genuine seriousness. "I don't think so. He can still see." Hoffman nodded as though this were a thoroughly satisfactory answer to a consequential question. Then he looked at Ray over Lily's head, and his expression shifted back into the register of two people with shared professional history communicating above a child's awareness. "Ray," he said with the weight of someone saying something professionally, but meaning it personally. "The movement hold on your aircraft flagged an operational alert in our corridor management system. When Carol ran the system query on your company name, she pulled the Continental Partnership file." He paused. "Your audit team was in their operations 14 months ago." "We filed the report in March," Ray said. "The accommodation compliance framework in that report." Hoffman looked at the folder on the podium. "That's yours." "My team's." "Yours," Hoffman said. He wasn't accepting the deflection, and both of them understood why, not for ego, but because accuracy required it. "Your signature on the executive summary. Your framework language. I read it when Continental submitted it as part of their partnership renewal documentation. I read it because it was the most substantive compliance framework I had seen a carrier voluntarily attached to a renewal agreement in 15 years. He paused. "I remember thinking it would survive contact with operational pressure." He looked at the gate area. "I was apparently optimistic." Ray said nothing. "The section on pediatric medical accommodations," Hoffman continued, "the documentation requirements, the escalation procedures for override situations, the specific language about what constitutes an acceptable alternative and what does not." He paused. "Would you characterize what occurred at this gate tonight as consistent with that framework?" Ray looked at him steadily. "No." "No." Hoffman agreed. He stood. He walked back to the podium, and when he turned to face the gate area, something had changed in how he occupied the space. The gathering phase was complete. He was in the other mode, the mode where information became decision and decisions became records. He addressed Merritt and Pruitt together in the tone of someone stating facts rather than making arguments. Continental Airways attached a binding compliance framework to their partnership renewal agreement 14 months ago. That framework was authored by Callaway Compliance Group and accepted as a contractual operational condition, not a best practice guideline, not a recommended procedure, a binding contractual condition. He picked up the folder. "The framework you violated tonight." He set it down. "This flight is under formal compliance event designation as of this moment. The corridor hold remains until I release it. Original seating will be restored immediately. This is not subject to further discussion." Captain Merritt uncrossed his arms. He had been standing with his arms crossed for the better part of an hour, and the uncrossing was not a dramatic gesture of surrender. It was the release of a posture that a man had been maintaining because it was all that remained of a position he was no longer defending, because the position had been rendered indefensible by documentation in the hands of a person who understood exactly what the documentation meant. He looked at Hoffman. He looked at the folder. Then for the first time that evening, he looked at Ray Callaway with the direct, undeflected gaze of someone who had stopped performing and was looking at what was actually there. Ray looked back, not with hostility, with the patience of someone who understood that people made wrong decisions under pressure, that institutional pressure was real and substantial, and that understanding this did not require forgiveness of it. He was not angry at Douglas Merritt. He had stopped being angry at people who failed under pressure a long time ago, because the alternative, the institutional architecture that created the conditions for failure, was the more consequential target. And anger was too expensive a fuel to spend on the people rather than the system. Merritt said, "I need to speak with my crew." Hoffman said, "5 minutes." Merritt turned and walked back into the jet bridge without looking at Ray again. Sandra Pruitt followed after a pause, and the door closed behind them, and Gate B-14 exhaled. Grant Ellison stood. He rose slowly with the weight of someone who had been sitting with something heavy and was not entirely confident of their footing under it. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Hoffman, then at Ray with the expression of a man who had done the calculation and arrived at a figure he did not like. He crossed to where Ray was sitting. Lily looked up at him. Grant Ellison looked at Lily, at the yellow sweater at Captain the Rabbit on her knees, at her left ear turned slightly away, and something crossed his face that was entirely genuine and entirely uncomfortable, and completely without the professional management he applied to most of his expressions. "Mr. Calloway," he said. Ray waited. "I want to be accurate about something." Grant Ellison spoke with the careful deliberateness of a man who had spent his career in rooms where the precise selection of words had consequences, and who understood that he was in one of those rooms now. "When I requested the upgrade, I was told there were available business class seats and that my connection delay qualified me for partner accommodation. I was not told that those seats were already assigned to a child with a documented medical need." Ray looked at him. "I believe you," he said. Grant Ellison blinked. He had prepared, Ray could see, for argument or accusation, or the kind of direct confrontation that allowed the confronted person to push back. He had not prepared for belief. "That doesn't change what happened," Ray said, "but it changes what you are responsible for." Grant nodded once. He was not absolved, he understood this, and Ray could see that he understood it. But he had been seen accurately, which was different from absolution, and in its own way more useful. It left him with a clearer accounting of himself than he would have had if Ray had held him responsible for everything indiscriminately. He looked at Lily one more time. "I hope she's better soon," he said. And because nothing else he could say would be adequate to what the evening had cost, he stepped back and returned to his seat. Diane Ellison had watched the exchange without expression. When Grant sat down beside her, she reached over and touched his arm, a small gesture, private, not designed to be observed. Ray noted it without looking directly at it. He filed it in the category of things that reminded him that people were more complicated and more redeemable than their worst moments suggested. Hoffman returned to Ray. He sat across from him, forearms on knees, in the posture of a man who was going to say something off the record while the record was still being assembled. "I can offer you internal resolution," he said quietly. Ray looked at him. "Formal internal review. Continental formally acknowledges the compliance failure. Your firm receives documented confirmation. Relevant staff receive mandatory retraining. The incident enters the partnership file as a resolved finding." He held Ray's gaze. "Clean, documented, and frankly better for your contract relationship with Continental than a public FAA filing." Ray looked at the folder in his lap. He looked at Lily, who had finished her crackers and was resting Captain on her knees and watching her father with the patient, attentive quiet she brought to moments when she understood something important was being decided. He looked out the window at the executive stand. He could make one call and the aircraft would move. It had always been that simple. The aircraft's position was not a threat he had deployed. It was simply a fact of where his company's plane had been parked when he arrived and what that fact had meant to people who understood corridor operations. He had not held the flight. He had simply been present in a way that mattered to the right systems, and those systems had done what systems did when the right input arrived. The leverage had never been the point. He looked at Hoffman. "Margaret's report sat in a queue for 11 days, he said. Hoffman went still. He had been at Margaret's funeral, one of 12 people in a Chicago cemetery in November. Rain standing quietly while Ray held Lily's hand and looked at the ground and kept his face completely composed because his daughter was watching. Hoffman knew about the queue. He knew about the report. He knew what Ray was and was not saying. He said nothing. He waited. "The report was correct," Ray said. "The documentation was complete. The process functioned exactly as designed, except for the 11 days. He stopped. 11 days is nothing. In the ordinary measure of administrative processing, 11 days is within tolerance, within normal variance, within acceptable parameters. It's a nothing number. He looked at Lily. It depends entirely on what happens in those 11 days to the people the process was designed to protect. Ray Hoffman said quietly, "Margaret's death was not caused by that report or that queue or those 11 days. Ray said with the precision of someone who had thought about this distinction for 4 years and needed it to be stated correctly. I know that. I have always known that. Her heart stopped because hearts stop and no report and no timeline had anything to do with it. He paused. But 11 days is the number. It's the number I carry for what the gap costs when you're not looking at the particular case, only the aggregate. He met Hoffman's eyes. Internal resolution closes this file. It makes it a data point in a partnership review cycle. It gets noted and actioned and eventually becomes background, the kind of background that nobody sees unless they're already looking. Hoffman listened without interrupting. The next father, Ray said, who walks up to that podium with a medical note and a sick child and no visible markers, he doesn't know about the internal resolution. He doesn't know the framework exists. He doesn't know what the form numbers are or what language makes a request legible to the system or that he has any standing at all beyond what a flight attendant decides to give him in 3 seconds at the aircraft door. He paused. He just knows that his seat is gone and that row 28 is what's available. Hoffman was quiet for a moment. You want the operational record, he said. FAA Accommodation Compliance Database, Ray said. Continental's public-facing incident log required under the partnership agreement. Staff retraining documented with timestamps and verification. And a revision to the boarding protocol that requires medical accommodation verification before any status-based reassignment is finalized. He paused. Not punishment, protocol. The next person who stands at that podium will have seen this file. That's the difference. Hoffman was quiet for a longer moment. That creates friction, he said, with Continental, potentially with the partnership renewal. I know. You've thought about this. For 11 days, Ray said, mostly between 2 and 4 in the morning when the hotel was quiet. Hoffman looked at him for a long moment, the look of a man who had known him long enough to recognize that this conversation had been settled before it began, and who respected that, even while acknowledging the cost of it. He nodded. The slow, deliberate nod of someone accepting the terms of something they had not designed but recognized as correct. It goes on the record, he said. Thank you, Stan. Don't thank me. Hoffman stood and picked up his tablet. It's the right call. That's why it's going on the record, and not because you asked. He looked at Lily. Get her home. He walked back to the podium. The jet bridge door opened. Captain Douglas Merritt came out alone. Sandra Pruitt did not follow immediately. He walked across the gate area with the measured pace of a man who had made a decision in the 5 minutes available to him and was carrying it with the specific weight that correct decisions carried when they arrived too late to prevent the thing they were correct about. He stopped beside Ray. Ray stood. Farrow had moved to the podium. The passengers were gathered at a respectful distance, boarding passes in hand, watching with the peripheral attention of people who understood they were observing something private. Hoffman and Stanton were processing documents. Garrett was managing the corridor hold paperwork with focused efficiency. Merritt looked at Ray with the direct, undeflected gaze of a man who had decided to stop performing a position and start accounting for a failure. I want to say something, he said. Not for the record, for myself. Ray waited. I came to that door with my mind already made up, Merritt said. I had Sandra's summary medical notation economy reassignment passenger refusing crew direction. I made my decision before I had anything except that summary, before I read the file, before I understood what I was looking at. He stopped, steadied himself. I've run aircraft for 28 years. 28 years of making decisions correctly under pressure, because I read what needed to be read and understood what needed to be understood before I acted. That is not what I did tonight. I know that. Ray looked at him. Douglas Merritt was 55 years old. He had earned his authority through 28 years of correct decisions made under genuine pressure, the 10,000 moments of judgment that constituted a career in command, each one added to the accumulation that allowed a person to walk through a door and be the most authoritative presence in a room. He was not a small man. He had simply been wrong tonight, and he was standing in that wrongness without decoration, which was Ray recognized. Its own kind of competence. Most failures start with a decision made before the information arrives, Ray said. Merritt looked at him. That's the gap between what the process requires and what people actually do when they're under pressure. And the departure board is showing a delay and someone is waiting. I've spent 30 years looking at that gap from the outside. I've been in rooms where people who are much better at their jobs than the gap suggests sat across from me and couldn't entirely explain how they ended up on the wrong side of it. He paused. Tonight you were on that side. I've been on the other side often enough to know it doesn't look as different as it should. Merritt absorbed this. The report will reflect the sequence accurately, Ray said. What you knew when you knew it, the decision you made. It will also reflect that you came out here and said this without being required to. He met his eyes. That matters to the record. Accountability documented voluntarily carries different weight than accountability extracted. Merritt nodded. Not the nod of a man seeking absolution. He was not looking for that, and Ray was not offering it. The nod of a man who had been seen clearly and accurately, and who had found that it was possible to stand inside that clarity without requiring anything else from it. He turned and walked back toward the aircraft. Sandra Pruitt came out of the jet bridge as he entered it. She walked to where Ray stood without her clipboard, without the practiced composure that had been her armor all evening. She stopped at a distance that left the conversation private while leaving Ray the choice of whether to receive it. She had been crying or very close to it, not performing it, managing the specific tension around the eyes of someone who had held something in for an hour and was past the point of comfortable containment. I made an assumption, she said. Ray waited. I looked at you in that door. The jacket, the shoes, no carry-on with a brand name, a child, no markers. She stopped, steadied herself with the deliberateness of someone controlling a physical response. I decided in approximately 3 seconds that you were someone who would accept being moved, that you wouldn't know the specific language for pushing back, that the easiest resolution was to move you and move on. She looked at him directly, which was costing her something visible. I've made that calculation before, with other passengers, with people who looked like they didn't have the standing to make it complicated. Most of the time, it resolves the way I expect it to. Ray said nothing. I saw the medical notation flagged in the system, she said. I categorized it as a general preference note rather than a specific clinical requirement, because I had already decided what you were, and I needed the file to confirm it, and I didn't read far enough to find out that it didn't. She paused. I decided what you were before I read what you had. Ray looked at her for a long moment. He thought briefly about what Margaret would have done in this moment. She had possessed a grace in receiving apologies that he had never managed to fully replicate, a way of letting someone be accountable without crushing them under the weight of the accounting, a way of accepting what was genuine in a person's acknowledgement without pretending it erased the cost. He had watched her do it many times and had understood each time intellectually how she did it. The execution had always been beyond him. You were right about the tired part, he said. Sandra Pruitt looked at him. I am tired, he said. 11 days is a long time to be away from home, and I was tired before Boston tired in the way that accumulates past the point of sleep fixing it. He held her gaze. You looked at me and saw a tired man with no visible markers. That part was accurate. He paused. What you were wrong about was what quiet meant, what tired meant, what no visible markers meant. She was still. Quiet isn't the same as uncertain, he said. Tired isn't the same as willing to accept less than what's documented and paid for and medically necessary for my daughter. And the absence of visible markers isn't the same as the absence of standing. He looked at Lily, who had stood and was holding Captain in one arm and her backpack strap with the other hand, waiting with the readiness of someone who had been promised something and was prepared to collect it. She has been quiet through 11 days of tests and procedures. She was quiet through a surgery she didn't entirely understand. Her being quiet didn't mean she didn't need the seat. Sandra Pruitt was quiet for a moment. I understand, she said. I know you do, Ray said. He picked up his briefcase. At the podium, Hoffman and Stanton were working through the operational documentation that would close the compliance event and release the movement hold. Farrow was completing her witness report. Garrett was cross-referencing the incident timeline with the gate log, thorough and methodical, doing the work with the care of someone who understood that details mattered. The two younger passengers who had been recording had put their phones away and were standing with the slightly stunned expression of people who had expected a different ending and were still integrating the one that had occurred. The older woman's sensible coat, gray hair, the paperback that had been forgotten for the last hour, approached Ray quietly in the way she had done everything all evening, without requiring acknowledgement, without seeking anything beyond the simple act of offering what she had. She stopped beside him. "I have a granddaughter," she said. 8 years old. Same surgery last spring. Ray looked at her. "You did the right thing," she said, without embellishment, without the qualifier that would have made it smaller. "Thank you for the crackers," he said. She smiled the smile of someone who had lived long enough to know the precise weight of small kindnesses and the difference between the ones that cost something and the ones that didn't. "She ate them well," she said. Then she picked up her bag and her paperback and joined the line that was beginning quietly to reform at the podium. And that was all. Lily tugged Ray's sleeve. "Are we boarding now?" "Yes." She looked at the line, then at the aircraft door, then at her father with the considering look she brought to situations where she wanted to be certain before committing to enthusiasm. He picked up her backpack and helped her put it on, adjusted the straps to the right position, smoothed the collar of the yellow sweater, looked at her, her steady eyes, her repaired ear turned slightly away from him, Captain the rabbit under her arm, the trust in her face that had never once in 7 years asked anything of him, except that he be worthy of it. "In the big seats," he said. She nodded once decisively and turned toward the boarding line. Carol Stanton handed Ray his boarding passes at the podium. The originals 2A and 2B, not reprinted slips, the ones that had been his since July and should not have left his hand. She held them for a moment before releasing them. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I should have asked different questions when the system flagged your name. I had the information and I asked the wrong questions with it." Ray took the passes. "Yes," he said. Not harshly, not gently, accurately. She nodded, accepting it without asking for more. At the aircraft door, Sandra Pruitt stood to the side, not with ceremony because ceremony would have been wrong, but with the practical acknowledgement of someone who understood that the appropriate posture now was simply to get out of the way. She did not offer a practiced greeting. She looked at Lily. "Hi," she said, simply. Lily regarded her with the careful assessment she brought to people she had been watching for a long time and was still deciding about. Then she said hi back and walked through the door. Inside, business class had changed. It had felt from the outside like defended territory, the guarded status-marked space of a cabin that required membership. From the inside, it was simply a cabin. Seats 2A and 2B were empty, clean, ready. The small window beside 2A showed the floodlit tarmac below the ground crew, completing final checks with the patient efficiency of people who had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. Lily climbed into 2A, the way she climbed into anything she had been promised, with the complete uncalculating confidence of a child who trusted that what was supposed to be there would be there. She settled herself, buckled her belt with careful attention, and placed Captain the Rabbit on the armrest, where he could see out the window. Ray sat in 2B. He helped her with the belt, stowed the briefcase in the overhead, adjusted the reading light. Then he sat back. For a moment, he simply sat. Not in the controlled performance-adjacent stillness he had maintained at the gate, not the precision of a man managing a situation in real time. Just a father in a seat beside his daughter on a flight that was finally, after everything, going home. The exhaustion arrived all at once. The way exhaustion arrived after long, sustained effort, gradually and then completely, each wave heavier than the one before it. The 11 days, the hospital corridors and the waiting rooms, and the extended stay hotel with the same 3 paperback novels, and the rotating takeout, and the window he had sat at in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, thinking about Margaret, and the gap, and the forms, and the things he could fix, and the permanent, unarguable weight of the things he could not. He closed his eyes, the cabin door sealed, the low mechanical sound of pressurization beginning, the rustle of passengers settling, the professional murmur of crew completing final checks, the small sounds of an aircraft preparing to do what aircraft were built to do. "Daddy." He opened his eyes. Lily was looking at him with the direct, earnest attention she brought to questions she had been carrying for a while. "Are you important?" she asked. He looked at his daughter, the yellow sweater, Captain on the armrest, her left ear turned slightly away from him by habit, and her eyes completely steady and completely trusting and completely free of any agenda except wanting the true answer. "No," he said. She frowned the small frown she wore when an answer didn't fit what she had observed. Then why did everyone listen? Ray looked at her for a moment. He thought about the answer the way he thought about everything carefully, without rushing, trying to find the words that said exactly what was true and nothing that wasn't. Outside the window, the tarmac moved slowly as the aircraft began to push back. The floodlights slid across the glass in sequence. The executive stand came into view briefly. The Callaway Compliance Group aircraft was gone, now cleared and departed, its purpose served by simply being parked where it had been parked for exactly as long as it needed to be. It had not been a threat. It had been a fact in a position where facts mattered. Because sometimes, Ray said, being right is louder than being loud. Lily considered this with the seriousness she gave to things that seemed important. Is that why you didn't yell? That's why. Because you were right? Because I was sure I was right, he said. And because being sure doesn't require a loud voice. It just requires being willing to stay where you are until the record catches up to what's true. She thought about this for another moment. Then she looked at Captain on the armrest and adjusted him so he faced more directly at the window. Okay, she said. And then, with the complete and unhesitating trust that was the most sustaining and the most demanding gift she had ever given him, she leaned against his arm and closed her eyes. Ray looked out the window. Chicago was 2 hours ahead. Home was 2 hours ahead. The apartment with Lily's drawings on the refrigerator and Margaret's books still on the shelf in the order she had left them. And the kitchen where he made coffee on mornings that were ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. The particular arithmetic of a life built around the things that mattered and the deliberate daily exclusion of the things that didn't. He opened the briefcase one final time. The FAA form was on top. He looked at it, the completed sections, the incident description, the staff identifications, the timeline, precise and accurate. Everything that needed to be on the record was on the record. Everything that needed to be named had been named. He removed the folder labeled Filed. He placed the form inside it. He closed the folder, he closed the briefcase. He stowed it properly and sat back in Seat 2B Business Class, Continental, Flight 1847 to Chicago O'Hare, and listened to his daughter breathe beside him and the engines build their steady purpose beneath them, and the aircraft begin to move with the gathered intention of something that was finally going exactly where it was supposed to go. The runway lights appeared, a long straight line of blue and white extending into the dark, marking the path as clearly as any document had ever marked anything. Ray Callaway closed his eyes. At Gate B14 of Boston Logan International, the documentation was being completed, and the files were being properly closed, and the small patient machinery of accountability was doing what it was designed to do. Not quickly, not dramatically, not with any ceremony, but permanently. Farrow and Garrett were finalizing the witness report. Hoffman and Stanton were processing the compliance event designation. The quarter hold was being released with the appropriate notations. The records were being made in the formats that made them findable, and the language that made them legible to the next person who needed to find them. It would not bring Margaret back. Nothing would bring Margaret back. Not the framework, not the audit, not the 4 years of careful, precise work that had followed her death. The queue existed. The 11 days existed. The 40 minutes in Washington, when he had not known, existed, with a permanence that no amount of correct documentation could address. But the next father, the one who would arrive at a gate somewhere, sometime without a briefcase full of forms, or 30 years of knowing exactly what to ask for, or the specific language that made a request legible to the system that was supposed to answer it, that father would find something different waiting for him. A protocol that had been tested under pressure, a record that had been made precisely, a standard that had been applied by the people who had violated it and would be applied by them differently the next time, because the next time there would be a file with their names in it, and they would have already seen what that felt like. A gap slightly smaller than before. That was the arithmetic. That was what the work cost and what it produced and why it was worth the cost. Not closure, not resolution. A gap slightly smaller for the next person who needed it to be smaller. The wheels left the ground. The transition was smooth, the practiced precision of a captain who knew his aircraft. The runway fell away below them. The terminal lights receded. The harbor beyond the airport appeared briefly, dark water under dark sky, and then the aircraft banked west and Boston disappeared, and the sky ahead was vast and dark and full of the particular indifference of altitude. Lily sighed in her sleep, a small sound, content and entirely unguarded. The sound of a child who trusted completely that she was being carried somewhere safe by someone who would not let her down. Ray opened his eyes once more. He looked out at the dark, at the altitude lights of other aircraft in the distance. at the stars where they were visible above the cloud layer, at the sky that was the same sky it had always been indifferent to compliance frameworks and operational holds, and the small daily consequential work of people trying to ensure that the distance between what systems promised and what they delivered was never quite as wide as it wanted to be. He looked at his daughter. He looked at his watch. Margaret's watch, the plain face with the black hands, the small date window showing a date that was like all dates, both entirely ordinary and the only one it would ever be. He held his wrist for a moment, not adjusting the watch, just holding it. The weight of it, the specific, irreplaceable weight of something that had been given with love by someone who understood him on an anniversary that seemed from this distance to have belonged to a different and more complete version of his life. Then he let his arm rest. Outside the window, the lights of the eastern seaboard moved slowly below them as the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude and the engines settled into their steady, sustained purpose. Boston was behind them. Chicago was ahead. Between them, 2 hours of dark sky and the particular silence of altitude, and his daughter breathing evenly against his arm, and the briefcase in the overhead, with its filed form and its ordered documentation, and the permanent, consequential record of one Friday evening when a tired father had stood in a boarding line and refused to accept the gap between what was written and what actually happened. Not because he was important, because he was sure, and because being sure in the end was the only authority that mattered. The aircraft leveled at cruising altitude turned its nose west and carried them home through the dark.